Welcome, everyone. My name is Kelvin Watson, and I am the Executive Director of the Las Vegas Clark County Library District. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our very special guest, the legendary journalist and TV news anchor, Mr. Dan Rather. Mr. Rather joined CBS News in 1962, and in his early career, he covered many of the historic events that have shaped our country, including the Civil Rights Movement, the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Vietnam War, and the Watergate scandal. In 1981, he became anchor and managing editor for the CBS Evening News, a position which he held for 24 years. His in-depth reporting helped to pioneer the news magazine format, helping to turn 60 Minutes into the longest running primetime show in American television history, as well as 48 Hours, which featured hard-hitting investigative reports. Upon leaving CBS, he founded his own production company, News and Guts, won an Emmy Award for Dan Rather Reports on Access TV, is celebrated as Facebook's favorite news anchor, and is the author of many books, including the instant New York Times bestseller, What Unites Us, which has just been re-released as a graphic novel. Mr. Rather is here with us today to talk to us about what unites us, and we are so privileged to have him. Thank you, Mr. Rather, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Director Watson. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to this.
Excellent. So we're just going to jump right in. I'm trying to hold back all the enthusiasm that I have with this opportunity, watching you for many years as a young man or growing up. And so let's jump right into these questions. So the full title of your book is What Unites Us: Reflections on Patriotism. You go on to define throughout this book what true patriotism looks like, and you draw a sharp contrast between it and nationalism. Please explain this difference for us and why you felt compelled to write this book.
Well, I'll try to do so. Thank you very much. As a prelude, as a preface, if you will, let me say that, I worry that patriotism with too many people has become a word that folks just don't feel comfortable with these days. And I regret that. I think it's something to be deeply concerned about for all of us. I think that comes from a misunderstanding of what patriotism is, what it really is. And I try to define it in the book I wrote, What Unites Us, and it's certainly part of the graphic novel book as well. In fact, the book in many ways begins with this, about the difference between patriotism and nationalism. And it has long been important to me, and I think it's important for every citizen, to separate patriotism from nationalism. Increasingly, in more recent years, I find people sort of equate the two, feeling that nationalism is the same thing as patriotism. It isn't. They are very different concepts. One is about humility and working together to make a better country. That's patriotism. The other is about arrogance, and I think we've seen where that can lead. Now, we have a lot of questions to deal with today, and I don't want to move on, but it's so important to me that you led with this question, because of all the things in the book, I think this may be the single most important thing. It's awfully hard to point to any one thing when you're talking about what unites a country. But in answer to your question of what the difference between patriotism and nationalism is, if I may, let me read a short section, read from the book, because I worked on this. I wanted it to be understandable to people, and I hope that people would discuss it. That it's important, and I'm quoting now from page 15. It's important not to confuse patriotism with nationalism. As I define it, nationalism is a monologue in which you place your country in a position of constant moral and cultural supremacy to all others. Patriotism, while deeply personal, personal to the fact that you are literally prepared to die for your country. But patriotism is also a dialogue with your fellow citizens and the larger world about what not only you love about your country, not only to discuss that, but also how you think the country can be improved and listening to other people about how they think the country can be improved. Patriotism at the very core, the reason I say is you equate it with humility, is to say, listen, we have a great country. We love this country passionately, indeed are prepared to die for it. But we are not so arrogant to think that we're morally and in every other way superior to every other people in the world. If you stop and think about it, that's not a very smart way of thinking things anyway, but it certainly, that is not patriotism. Now, I'll conclude now with saying that unchecked nationalism leads to conflict and war. The idea that your country is above all countries in everything, morally, ethically, superior in every way, that's what leads to conflict and war. And extreme nationalism leads to that pretty quickly, and we know that from history. Unbridled patriotism can lead to the betterment of society. Patriotism is rooted in humility. Nationalism is rooted in arrogance. Unquote from the book.
Thank you, Mr. Rather. Before we move to the next question, I just wanted you to know I listened to the book and certainly appreciated it, and I understand it because before I became a library director, I actually served in the U.S. Army as an infantry officer. So when I was listening to the book and you were talking about patriotism, it made me reflect on the service and my thoughts about the country, and it certainly is a great way to start off the book. So I just wanted to share that as a transition to our next question. So in What Unites Us, you describe a sense of wonder, awe, and optimism for the United States, but also a sense of humility, as you just mentioned, about our mistakes as a nation and our need to do better. Why is it patriotic for us to recognize areas where our nation should improve?
Because that's necessary for our nation to improve. In order for the nation to improve, we have to recognize that it needs improvement. We have to identify those places where it needs improvement. We need to prioritize those places where it needs improvement the most, the fastest, if you will. And look, we've made many mistakes as a country. We can go back in the history of the country from the very beginning, primarily with the question of slavery and how the country refused to deal with the moral fact of slavery for so long in the beginning. Everything from that to more recent times, when we went into Iraq, which turned out to be a strategic blunder of historic proportions, in which the country, on the basis of untrue information given from the power at the top, let itself be carried into a war, which has had, even up to this present moment, disastrous consequences for the country. So, to answer your question, that to be patriotic is to question what the country's doing at every time. And I would say we're least patriotic is when we stop asking the questions. A good example of this would be, Director Watson, at the time when the country was preparing to go into the Iraq War, just after we turned the millennium, not long after 9/11. We didn't, as a people, as individual citizens, the press, including myself, we did not ask the tough questions of ourselves. We didn't ask the tough questions of our leaders. And one reason we didn't, let's be confessional about this, is that to do so, you would be accused of being unpatriotic. Don't support the troops. Don't support our guys in uniform. When in fact, the most patriotic thing that could have been done at the time was to ask those tough questions.
Wow, that's great. and actually is helpful in me transitioning to the next question. So you you talk in the book about the importance of dissent and freedom of speech and how the First Amendment guarantees these freedoms so that can hear from those who are challenging the status quo. You say that this was especially striking to you as a reporter covering the civil rights movement and how the dissenting voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed your worldview. Please talk to us about why dissent is a patriotic value.
Well, dissent is the power to disagree. And we have to stop and remind ourselves what a precious freedom this is, how rare it has been in history when people are free, really free to dissent. Dissent's the power to see status quo and a power structure that you feel strongly needs to be changed and to speak out about it. Now, almost universally through history, those in power didn't allow much of any dissent. And the reason they didn't is because in the end, it could challenge their power. Now, a lot of what you disagree about, you could be wrong about it. The idea with dissent, some people say, well, these people who are dissenting, they have the wrong information. They're way off base. Sometimes that's true, but it's really important to have the freedom, that they have the freedom to do it. And keep in mind that the First Amendment to our Constitution, the one that deals with, among other things, but perhaps most importantly, freedom of the press, it doesn't say, in freedom of dissent, it doesn't say that the press is free or that dissent is free as long as it's correct. You have a right to be wrong, but to be heard. And I do think as time goes, as the years have gone by, it's eroded each succeeding generation appreciation of how important this is. The freedom to speak out. The founding fathers, sometimes when you say founding fathers, eyes begin to glaze over and say, well, the founding fathers, they certainly weren't the fount of all wisdom, and they were not. But they were really smart on this point. They understood the power of creating a venue for dissent, a constant venue for people who say, listen, you're wrong, you're going the wrong direction. Hey, listen, stop, wait, think, listen to what I'm saying. That's the reason the founding fathers enshrined it in the Bill of Rights. And certainly Dr. Martin Luther King, someone who made a tremendous difference in my own life, that I have said many times in the past and never reluctant to repeat, that when I covered Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in some of the early stages of the civil rights movement, not the very early stages, but fairly early on, as a child of institutionalized racism, I grew up in Texas, where you can say, well, it wasn't as bad as Mississippi or Alabama, but it was institutionalized racism, no question about it. Well, covering Dr. King day in and day out, week in and week out, changed me as a person, and it changed me as a professional. It had a profound effect on me. And one reason is that among the many other strengths that Dr. King had, he understood how dissent could be a powerful tool, what a powerful tool it could be when you match dissent with protest, nonviolent protest, and social activism. But keep in mind, and I think this is often forgotten about Dr. Martin Luther King, that, central, right at the core of what he was trying to do was, yes, dissent, protest, be socially active, but be non-violent. And he recognized that that was the route to making profound change. But at the very core of that was the freedom to dissent. It's easy to forget when Dr. Martin Luther King started asking for change. Some would say demand for change. I wouldn't argue with the verb, demanding change. That it was seen to be that the country couldn't survive it. There were people who were saying, listen, I think Dr. King may have a point about this, but you know what? If we allow these people quote unquote, these other people, if we allow them to have more rights than they have now, it'll destroy the country. Dr. King's answer, of course, was no. It was beyond that. Not only is it no, but that, if you think about it, that's a foolish thing to think about. But, you know, I do think, Dr. Watson, that as time goes along, and including this present time, that we have to remind ourselves what an important freedom dissent is, because dissent, particularly reasoned dissent, can help save the country. This is a perilous time for the country. I don't want to understate it, but I don't want to overstate it. This is a perilous time for the country. We need people to dissent and say, listen, I think you're wrong about the police methods. We can disagree. We can say, well, wait a minute. I don't think you're right about that, or I think you go too far in how you want to prove it. But we need to deal with these things. And I can't move off this question without, I'm reminded that Elie Wiesel, a lot of people don't know who Elie Wiesel is now, but Elie Wiesel, who was a Holocaust survivor, perhaps the most articulate historian about the Holocaust and the importance of keeping it in mind to teach on. He said this about dissent, and I quote him in the book. And let me say, and I say with some pride, but with no arrogance, that Elie Wiesel was a friend of mine, and he became a mentor, a very wise man. But Elie Wiesel, in his acceptance speech for the Nobel Peace Prize, said, and I quote, and I urge our listeners here to listen carefully, I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Let me repeat that from the quote. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Continuing to quote, silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere, and we must not stay silent. Quote unquote, Elie Wiesel.
Powerful, definitely powerful. You talk about Dr. King, and if you were here in my office, I actually have a picture of Dr. King in my office that I that I have, and that is just for myself personally to recognize that I probably wouldn't be where I am today without having had Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. do what he did, and that he spoke up and that he dissented. So so I have that in my office. I wish you could see it. It's not in the frame. So but it's just something that I reflect on every day. So let's continue on in this I won't say a conversation. I'm asking the questions. You're doing a great job answering. I want to get back to the founding fathers for a moment, and the Constitution. And freedom of the press was, as you said, also included in the First Amendment as a bedrock principle of our country. For many people, you represent a time when journalism was deeply trusted by the American public and treated with respect by politicians. What role does journalism play in a free society? And how do we get back to that trust?
Well, first of all, journalism is a key to the health and security of the country. So often when we talk about journalism and the importance of journalism and free press, it comes out as just reporters talking among themselves, and it's all about reporters and newspapers. It's about the country. It's about the very vitals of the country. And the freedom of the press was put right up there in the First Amendment of the Constitution, because those who wrote the Constitution, and those founding fathers, if you will, they feared power. Kings, queens, generals, they feared not having any check on power. So they built three separate forms of departments of government. the administrative with the presidency, the legislative with the Congress, and the Supreme Court, so they could check on one another, have checks and balances. But that wasn't enough for them. They wanted to build in check and balances on power. And sort of mentally in their minds, the sign that says, never trust power, always have a check and balance. You can never have too many checks and balances on power. And the press was to be part of that system of checks and balances. Now, I like to say, because I like to remind myself, but most importantly, I like to remind my fellow citizens that a free and independent, truly independent, fiercely independent when necessary press is the red beating heart of freedom and democracy. That you aren't going to have the kind of government we have, which is a constitutional republic based on the principles of freedom and representative government. If you don't have a free press and a very active press, and one that's backed by a majority of public opinion, not in any given subject, but as a whole, in the importance of the press, then you aren't going to have this kind of country for very long. Now, it's a check on the powerful. That's what it's designed to do, is a check on the powerful, to seek the truth and reveal truths that are hidden. And I understand that trust is an issue, and it ought to be an issue. It should ought to be an issue. This has been stoked in part. The distrust of the press is partly as a result of mistakes we've made. And certainly I've made my mistakes. Anybody in journalism makes mistakes. Journalism is not a precise science. It is on its best as a kind of crude art. Mistakes are going to be made. Nobody can do it perfectly. But that's not the point. The point is that overall, in the main, is when the press is trying to do the right thing, ferret out what the powerful don't want folks to know. And by the way, let me say, I don't think it may not be in any of the books, but it's one of the things I like to say is, and remind people when we talk about this issue of trust with the press and who's to be trusted and who isn't to be trusted and why the press does what it does, is that, folks, news, real news, is basically what somebody somewhere, usually a very powerful person, doesn't want the public to know. Almost all the rest is just propaganda and entertainment. That's what the powerful doesn't want you to know. So when we talk about trust with the press, I hope the public understands. I fear that in too many quarters they don't. That distrust of the press has been stoked by the powerful. They want the public to believe that the press is all liars, all, as the one who is no longer president used to say, enemies of the people. Stop and think. Former president, well, I'd rather not say his name, frankly, but the former president was always saying, I'd like to strike that from the record because I don't like to be smart in remarks, but he was so unrelenting by attacking the press. I think not enough people, and many good friends of mine who support President Trump and still support him for that matter, fail to grasp this point. Is that he didn't want the press poking around on what he was doing, what he was really doing. By the way, very few presidents do. And so what he sought to do, as a powerful, nearly always do, President Nixon did some of the same, any number of Democratic presidents done the same, is that you try to kill the messenger and you try to spread the word. Our problems are not the problems. Our problems are these damn reporters that call attention to our problems. So stop for a second. No, it's not the people who call attention to the problems. We have problems with racial justice in the country. We have problems with meeting climate change. We have problems with an education system that's probably out of date and needs reform. We've got real problems. So when the powerful hear the press bring these problems to the fore, saying, listen, these are problems, then it's, well, you can't trust these people, you know. So I hope folks understand that I'm not sure how we regain the trust that we need with people, other than to keep doing the important work that reporters do every day. So in answer to the question of how do we regain trust, I don't have the answers, but it starts with reporters, including myself, just do the job. Do the job. And what is the job? The job is to gather facts. And do not let your readers or listeners or viewers succumb to the argument, well, there really are no facts. You know, the whole business of alternative facts was part of the gospel of a recent presidential administration. It's not true. There's some things that are factual. Look, 2 and 2 does not equal 5. 2 and 2 equals 4. Water does not run uphill. These are facts. So what is the job of the press? Establish facts on the way to, in the end, it's a search to get to the truth, or as close to the truth as is humanly possible, and tell it. When we do that job and do it as best we can, even when we make mistakes, then I think we build trust.
Wow. So again, another great a great way to transition. So in the, I'm the library director, so this is the library question now. So um, so in the book, you devote an entire chapter to books, which I'm so happy about, and it's actually a love letter, I thought, to libraries. You know, because libraries were important to you as a young person, and they important to me as a young person and as an adult. You know, growing up in rural Texas. Please share your thoughts on the power of books and the importance and art of reading.
Well, first of all, reading is one of the great joys of my life. And it was the beginnings of it being one of the great joys of my life was my introduction to the local library when I think I was 6, maybe 7 years old, on the edges of Houston, Texas. It was the local library, small library, not the big library downtown. But the moment I was introduced to that small library for the first time, that was the beginning of my great joy of a life of reading. And because of that, libraries have long been among the happiest places on earth for me. And I'm glad you said that what we have in the book, What Unites Us, including in the graphic novel edition of the book, it was intended to be a love letter to libraries. I think they deserve it. And I think particularly given this particular time here as we edge into the third decade of the 21st century and people are saying, well, with the internet, do you really need libraries anymore? Answer, by the way, a profound yes, exclamation point, and perhaps in some ways now more than ever. But, you know, if you think about what you can get at a library, libraries have changed with the times. By the way, a brand new library just opened here in Austin, Texas, from where I'm speaking to you. And it has almost instantly became one of the new favorite places of the whole city, and partly because this is the new library. It's as much a community center as it is a depository for books. But at any rate, we get back to the point that you think about what you get at a library. You get a passport to knowledge and wisdom, no matter your background, no matter your status, no matter how tough life gets on the outside and how many people discriminate against you, how many people kick you around, how many people tell you you're a dumbass or whatever. That doesn't matter in the library. There is the knowledge and wisdom you need to make of yourself whatever you want to make of yourself and to learn anything. No matter your background, your economic status, it doesn't matter. You walk into the library and there's all out for you. You learn, you explore, you grow, you escape. You can become as good as your determination in a library. I could go on about the rest of the afternoon. We won't, but I will say this. You know, everybody reads a little differently. Some people read faster, some people read slower. And you know, what turned me on to reading, and what I try to do now and encourage other people to do, is read what you love, certainly, but also try to stretch yourself some. A great way to begin is asking a librarian. If you want to know where to start, or you say, well, I know what I love, but I don't know how to stretch myself, just go into the library and start talking to the librarian. He or she will help you.
Well, a couple of things about libraries. I have another question about libraries, but so you mentioned the Austin Public Library. Uh, a friend of mine, Mr. Roosevelt Weeks, is the director of that library. So I'm gonna tell him I mentioned him today. But the other thing that, I'll tell you, my opinion of libraries, and I'll try to summarize what you said. The libraries to me are the great equalizer. That it equalizes everything. It is, and that's why I got into libraries, was to do the job that I'm doing and impact people's lives. So I appreciate you sharing that. And so another question about libraries is, and you talked about the 21st century, so this will be perfect. So public libraries champion free access to information for all. And this is easier than ever as the public transitions towards reading books on digital devices. Or in my case, I listen to more of my books personally. So I loved listening to you as you were reading the book, your book. But this has enabled libraries to reinvent our buildings as community centers, as you said, educational centers, offering STEAM programming, adult programming, access to computers, free Wi-Fi, what things we call maker spaces, etc. Um, how will the 21st century library contribute, in your mind, to a better society and a stronger democracy?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate what you describe as the modern library. You did as good a job of that as I've heard, and a whole lot better job than I can do of talking about the modern library, what it is. But libraries have proven to have in the past, they're proving it every hour of every day in the present, and they will in the future, to have a transformative effect on the lives of people who enter the libraries, and all ages, communities, and the country as a whole. Libraries, I want to repeat it, have a transformative effect on the lives of people. Now, one reason they do is that libraries are living civic institutions. They grow with the times, as some of the things you outlined that libraries do now. Wi-Fi, for example, hasn't been that long ago that Wi-Fi wasn't even in the language. But nonetheless, they're living civic institutions, and libraries welcome anyone that wishes to become a more independent and a more informed citizen. Think about it, there's no other public resource that so well encapsulates this inspirational notion of democracy, the inspirational notion that you can be, if you're a free person, that you can be everything that you want to be, everything you aspire to be, or at the very least, you're going to have the best chance to do that. In many ways, they're great equalizer libraries. Also, let me footnote, and just bouncing off today's headlines, if you will, there are these efforts in various state legislatures around the country to limit what can be taught, particularly in public schools. You probably read about this. Maybe our listeners here have been reading about it. State legislators say, well, listen, we want to put a cap on teaching certain things. Slavery generally comes up. We don't want to teach too much about that. We don't want to teach too much about what happened to indigenous people, the original Native Americans, if you will. Okay, state legislatures can do that with what's taught in public schools. They can command what goes into the textbooks. They can command what goes in the classroom. But in the library is the last bastion where it's much more difficult for the powerful to limit what's available in the libraries than it is in public schools. I don't want to lead us off on a very controversial pathway here, but I hope folks can see the difference. There's one thing, the legislatures have some power, considerable power, over what goes to public schools, far less with libraries. Now, to bring this thought fully around in trying to answer your question, through libraries, through books, through knowledge, through access to technology, which is one of the things libraries have gotten very good at now. You know, let me just pause and say, if you're from a tough neighborhood, maybe a neighborhood that sociologists call it so-called transitional neighborhood, which means a tough neighborhood, where you don't feel you have full access to technology, get yourself to the library. The library will probably have the technology you need to reach into it. But anyway, you know, we can become more learned. There's no excuse for any person in this country not to be an informed citizen when you have libraries within walking distance of most Americans.
Perfect. Yes, exactly. My neighborhood library when I was a kid was literally less than a block away. So, yeah, and I haven't been out of libraries, it seems like, since then. So I've got one more question before we transition to talk a little bit more about the graphic novel before we wrap up. And but I think this is an important question, so I would definitely want to get this in. In the book, What Unites Us, it's divided into chapters named by single words, which you believe define what builds patriotism and a belief in our shared destiny as a nation. So I'm going to mention a few words of these chapter titles, and if you could briefly summarize why these matter in America. So I'll give you all four, and then we'll see how we get to it. So first is inclusion, second is empathy, the next is service, and the fourth is courage.
Well, let's start. Let's see. Inclusion was the first, I think. Inclusion. Well, among other things, it's important to recognize the difference between inclusion and tolerance. Let's remind ourselves tolerance is, well, okay, I will tolerate that person, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to include that person in important things. So recognize that there's a difference between inclusion and tolerance. We, as individual people, as communities, and as a country, we're at our best when we welcome and celebrate our differences and come together to share our gifts and our strengths as all one. We create a better whole out of our separate parts, but we can't create that better whole by keeping ourselves separate. That's the reason I say inclusion is absolutely imperative to keeping a society such as ours, this constitutional republic, going. Inclusion and recognizing the difference. It isn't just good enough to tolerate another person. The essential is inclusion. That's where you really make headway to inclusion. And I find a lot of people, even at this late date, who sort of confuse tolerance and inclusion and say, well, okay, listen, put these in quotation marks, we gave them this or that. I tolerate them. Okay, tolerance is one thing. That's the minimum. What we're looking for is the maximum with inclusion. Let's see, the second one was what? Empathy.
Empathy, yes, sir.
Well, we need, first of all, to understand the difference between empathy and compassion. There's a dictionary definition that differentiates these two. So we need to try to understand how others are feeling. That's what empathy is. Empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is a good thing to have, but empathy is not sympathy. It's not just compassion, if that matters. Empathy is saying to yourself, as close as I can, I probably never can fully understand what the other person is thinking or living through, but I'm doing my best to mentally, within myself, walk in their shoes, to try to understand what others are feeling is the core of empathy. Now, this is part of the bonds that bring us together as a country. and connect us to the larger world, empathy, that we see the terrible toll that COVID is having in India. We have experience with it where we say to ourselves, I really can't imagine what it's like in India, where they're having the worst of the worst. But empathy is saying, I'm trying my best insofar as it's humanly possible for me to know what they're feeling. Or for children on either side of the Israeli and Palestinian tragedy of the last few days. Empathy would be saying, look, whatever I feel politically about this, for the women, children, and old people particularly who are suffering with this, not to have equivalence, because that's a whole other thing, but there hasn't been so on each side. But my point here is to say to yourself, gosh, I can't imagine having to go through this, but I'm going to try my best to understand what people who are there are feeling. That's empathy, and you can never get too much of it.
So the next one was service, and then we got courage after that.
Well, service. Well, service is very often about joining a movement that's bigger than yourselves, and you are bigger than you are. I think, I'm not sure of this, Director Watson, but I think most people aspire to be part of something bigger than themselves. Yes, we have our ambitions. Yes, we want to succeed. You'd like to be director of the Library of Congress, and I hope someday you get to do that. But we all dream. But service is part of that, connecting with part of each individual person who says, I want to be part of something bigger myself. So you look for something that you can contribute. It says that it's not about me. For once in my life, it's not about me. It's not about forwarding my career. It's about giving service to others. It's about recognizing your privilege. And I would say that we all are privileged to a degree. Certainly some people are more privileged than others, but we're all privileged to live in this country. And, you may, I suggest anybody watching, listening to this, you may want to give some serious thought to thanking your lucky stars, being on your knees and praying thanks that you are privileged to be born in this country, or to come to this country, to live and be a citizen in this country. But service is about investing in your community, and recognize that when you invest in the community, when you invest with your neighbors in helping them, everybody benefits. You mentioned your service in the U.S. Army. Military service is one high form of service. And I do want you to know in a personal and direct way that I and my family deeply appreciate the time and effort that you gave in military service to the country. But there are lots of forms of services, but the important thing is to recognize that it allows you to be part of something bigger than yourself. Oh, let's see, courage. Well, first of all, I like to remind myself, and I don't mind helping to remind others, that courage is being afraid, but going ahead anyways. That's what courage is. There's a lot that's scary in this world. And nobody, I don't care who you are, nobody gets through this world without being afraid at sometimes. And I'm always suspicious of people who say, I'm never afraid. The one thing, I don't think they really mean it. But, we need resilience in order to persevere. And part of that resilience is made up of courage. Courage comes in a lot of forms. There are countless acts of courage happening, every day, every second, all over the world. And we need to recognize those acts of courage and be encouraged by those acts of courage. Quiet, unheralded courage is perhaps the most powerful. I've seen it more times than you can imagine, including on battlefields and datelines and faraway places long since forgotten. And frequently when people talk about courage, the first thing that pops into mind is kind of battlefield courage. But courage comes in many forms. And I can't remember the name of there is a philosopher who once said, and I agree, that courage is the most important quality to have, because all the other good qualities stem from courage. It begins with courage. We talked about being inclusive. Sometimes it takes courage to be inclusive. We talked about empathy. Sometimes it takes courage to be empathic. So if you think of courage as a wellspring of all the other really notable attributes of good character, then you find yourself thinking about courage and remembering, well, courage is being afraid but going ahead anyway.
Excellent. So now let's transition to what unites us, the graphic novel. Oh, I guess I gotta also say that Dr. Carla Hayden, the current Librarian of Congress, I'll let her keep doing her job a little bit longer. My friend and mentor, Dr. Carla Hayden. So um, so let's talk about the latest edition of What Unites Us, which you have just re-released as a new graphic novel. The original print edition was first published in 2017, but the subject matter and title of the book are more relevant than ever. What inspired you to evolve the messages from the book into a graphic novel? By the way, it's a beautiful book. I have a copy on my desk. It's a beautiful book, the graphic novel.
I'm surprised you to know that I happen to have a copy right here on my own desk. There you go. Well, by the way, I was surprised I thought it was going to be in a paperback. As you know, it's a hardback book of sorts. But, I'm always interested in encouraging people to get the book. But I want to treat your question seriously about what inspired us to do the graphic novel. I'm going to be candid with you. Politicians sometimes have a saying, candor when convenient. Well, this is not necessarily a convenient time, but I am going to deal in candor. I never heard the phrase graphic novel before the publisher of this graphic novel came to me. And when I heard the phrase graphic novel, I said a version of, well, what in the world is that? A graphic novel? What do you mean a graphic novel? And when they described it, again, candor when convenient, I said, oh, you mean a comic book? Of course, they said, no. Comic books are fine for some people, and there are comics are made into books, but this is not a comic book. It's an illustrated book, So I got interested. So the publisher came to us. That's what inspired us to do it. I didn't know much about it. They emerged after I began to read about how successful graphic novels were, particularly my friend, and he was my friend John Lewis, the iconic congressman from Georgia who died recently, that he had a book that was made into a graphic novel. And I was struck by the fact that it did pretty well and it reached an audience not easily or regularly reached by regular published books. So, this whole idea of graphic novels emerged well after my reading habits were set. So I didn't know what to expect other than wanting to reach, the opportunity to reach a wider audience. And if there was any inspiration, it was the talk, look, if you do publish this kind of book, a graphic novel, it will reach people who never even heard of What Unites Us in its hardback original form or even in its paperback form. And then when the book began to take shape with the amazing artistry of Tim Foley, you can't go through this book and not see how talented he is. Frankly, I was amazed. Yes, the words are the same. They took the words of the original book, What Unites Us. They are condensed, words are the same. But there's a different feel, a different tone, if you will, to this book. The flow, the pace, the imagery, it's fresh and refreshing, if I say so myself. For people watching and listening to this, they say, well, Dan's trying hard to sell a book. That's true, but I can truthfully say it isn't about the money. Often when they say it's not about the money, it's about the money. But in this case, that's not true. Here, that the possibility of reaching people, particularly younger people, who might not be exposed otherwise to what unites us, continues to fire my imagination about what the book's potential is. And frankly, is one reason I look forward to talking to you this afternoon.
Well, I must say, Mr. Rather, I know we're running short. We're running short on time, but you just answered all three of some of my other questions with that one question. So I appreciate that. And by the way, when I first heard a graphic novel, not long ago, I was in that same place. I said the same thing. This is a comic book, so I'm with you. And I do have a copy and have read Congressman John Lewis's March, so which is also in my office as well. As you can see, I'm a great. I believe in supporting this history, this great history. So that's what I'll say. Uh, so I have a wrap up question. It's a little long, but it kind of ties in and pulls everything together. People acknowledge the sense of injustice in our society, but few spend a lifetime digging deeply into the causes um, and effects of it, as you have done, from covering Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to the first Black president, President Barack Obama. You have been on the front lines of the stories that have shaped our nation. From all that you have learned about America over the course of your life and career, what is the primary message that you hope young people will take away? And not just young people, but all people will take away from your graphic novel version of what unites us.
I hope people will take away the truth, and it is the truth, that you can make a difference and don't give up on our country. We've had struggles before, and there'll be we're in the middle of great struggle at the moment for the soul of the country. And there'll be plenty of struggles to come. But this country has constantly been made, and this is not just an opinion, but history shouts the fact that our country has been made better each time by new generations. Each new generation has made the country better by adding their voices, their perspectives, and their actions. Let me pause and say you're right that I sometimes think that my reporting time stretched partly from Martin Luther King to Barack Obama. When I was covering Dr. Martin Luther King as a much younger reporter, we used to sit around at night after the day's work was done. They say that politicians, hangmen, and journalists do their best work after midnight. Well, sometimes after midnight, when we speculate, this was 1962, 1963, we'd say, do you think you'd ever see the day that a Black person could possibly be maybe a congressman or a mayor in a place like Georgia? And we'd say the general opinion was probably not in my lifetime. I was probably 32 years old at the time. The answer was probably not in my lifetime. And in terms of, well, would you ever think the country would ever have a Black man as president? Unanimous among reporters covering the civil rights movement time. Not in our lifetime, and probably not in our sons and daughters' lifetime, maybe some several hundred years away. I take that digression just to show that how often we can be wrong about the slowness or speed of progress. So in answer to your question, what I hope people take away from the book is keep that in mind that, listen, we've made tremendous progress on many other fronts. We have a long way to go on any number of other fronts. The work is never done, because remember that the founding fathers didn't say the country was a perfect country or that it would ever be a perfect country. What they did was hang out a polar star, that navigational star, and give us a compass box and said, a star is perfection. We'll never reach the star. We can never be perfect, but we have to be constantly trying to reach a more perfect union. So to those who say, well, what's the message out of the book? Understand that that's what we are. We're always trying to be more perfect, and that you can make a difference. Don't give up on the country. Try to understand where we come from and try to direct where we go. And one message out of the book, I hope, and I hope this is particularly true of the graphic novel, to tell you the truth, because young people will be reading this book, is the country needs you. It needs your energy. It needs your enthusiasm. It needs your ingenuity. It needs your intelligence. It needs your decency. If we're going to realize what unites us, then we need you, each and every one of you, to lead the way. That's basically the message.
All I can say is, wow, I'm listening to you. First of all, as I started out to say, as I close, as a younger man and an African American man, I never would have thought I would have had the opportunity to be speaking to you today. Watching you on television when I was a kid, right? So I'm taking that and sharing that too with the listeners, the young folks, the young people. That anything is possible, and I'm privileged, and I'm certainly privileged to just be having this conversation with you today. And I just want to say that on behalf of the Las Vegas Clark County Library District, myself, I thank you for your generosity in spending so much time with us today, with me today. And I know that we all will enjoy reading the new graphic novel, What Unites Us. Thank you, Mr. Rather.
Thank you very much, Director Watson. I wish you good luck and Godspeed with your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.